I don't know why I did it. That night, everything inside me shattered. A storm of emotions I couldn't control swept through me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless and lost. I'm 19, a college student trying to carve out a place for myself in this overwhelming, chaotic world. But beneath the surface, I'm a tangled mess of doubts, fears, and unanswered questions. I'd moved out of my mom and stepdad's house to live in the dorm a few months ago, hoping to find some semblance of independence, but that night, I came back home without a word of warning. I didn't want Mom to see me like this. My eyes red and swollen from crying, my hair a wild, tangled mess like it had been whipped by a relentless wind, my hands trembling from exhaustion and nights of restless, broken sleep. I just wanted to find Tom, my stepfather, the man who'd stepped into my life when I was 8 years old and became the steady, unshakable anchor I never thought I'd have. The house was cloaked in darkness when I pushed the front door open, the hinges creaking softly in the stillness. Mom's faint snoring drifted from her room down the hall, a steady rhythm I'd heard 1,000 times growing up, a sound that once lulled me to sleep but now only deepened the ache in my chest. I didn't want to wake her. Mom always worried too much, her eyes narrowing with concern at the slightest hint of trouble, and I couldn't face the barrage of questions I had no answers for. I slipped off my worn-out sneakers, the soles scuffed and frayed from months of restless wandering, and left them by the door, their quiet thud against the floor the only sound breaking the silence. Barefoot, I padded down the hallway, my feet pressing against the cold, polished wood, each step letting out a tiny creak that echoed in the empty house like a whispered secret. Tom's room was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar, and a faint bluish glow from his phone spilled out into the shadows. He was always up late, reading thick novels with cracked spines, scrolling through endless articles online, or just sitting there lost in thoughts I could never quite decipher. But tonight, when I nudged the door wider and stepped inside, I saw he was asleep. Tom lay sprawled across the bed, his breathing deep and even, a quiet rhythm that filled the room with a strange, comforting calm. He wore a faded gray t-shirt, slightly wrinkled from being tossed on carelessly, and a pair of dark blue boxer shorts that clung loosely to his frame. The blanket was pulled haphazardly to one side, exposing his strong, weathered arm marked with faint scars from years of outdoor work, and his broad chest rising and falling with each slow, steady breath. I stood there, frozen in the doorway watching him, feeling like all the pain I'd been carrying inside me was clawing its way out, screaming to be soothed. The past few weeks had been a waking nightmare. School buried me under a mountain of assignments and unspoken expectations. My friends drifted away because I couldn't muster the energy for their shallow chatter. And every night in the dorm I'd lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering who I was, what I was doing, and why I felt so utterly alone. I missed home, but not the home with Mom. I missed Tom, the quiet safety he brought into my life, even though he wasn't my real father. I didn't think. My feet moved on their own, carrying me forward as if drawn by some invisible force, and before I could stop myself, I'd climbed onto the bed and lay down beside him. His body radiated warmth, a stark contrast to the icy void that had settled deep in my bones. I pressed myself against him, my hand resting lightly on his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. He didn't wake up right away, just shifted slightly in his sleep, a low mumble escaping his lips, maybe Mom's name, Sarah, or some fragmented phrase lost in the haze of his dreams. I didn't stop. My hand slid down, brushing over the soft cotton of his shirt, then slipping beneath it, my fingers grazing the warm, smooth skin of his torso. My breath grew heavier, ragged, a chaotic mix of longing and desperation surging through me like wildfire. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I needed him, needed to feel connected, to feel wanted, to feel anything other than the hollow emptiness that had consumed me. "Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible in the stillness, but he didn't stir. I'd started calling him Dad when I was 12, not because he'd ever asked me to, but because it felt right. He wasn't my biological father. My real dad had walked out on Mom and me when I was too young to even remember the sound of his voice, leaving behind a gaping hole I'd spent my life trying to fill. But Tom was different. He came into my world with a gentle, lopsided smile, a rusted old bike he'd fixed up to teach me how to ride, and a quiet patience that weathered my tantrums and tears. He'd sit with me at the kitchen table, listening as I rambled about bullies at school or failed math tests, his warm brown eyes steady and kind. He wasn't perfect, He'd fumble over words when he tried to comfort me, snap when I spilled milk across the counter, but he stayed. And now lying beside him I felt something shift inside me, something deeper than the bond we'd built over the years. A longing I didn't dare name but couldn't push away. I leaned down, pressing my lips to his neck, trembling as they brushed against his skin. A familiar scent washed over me. The cheap, woody soap he'd used for years, mingled with the faint bitterness of coffee he'd probably sipped before bed. My hand kept moving, sliding down his stomach, tracing the firm lines of muscle I'd never paid attention to before. I tugged his shirt up higher, exposing more of his tanned skin, and pressed my cheek against it, breathing him in as if I could somehow hold on to him forever. He let out a soft groan in his sleep, his body shifting slightly, responding even though his mind was still lost in dreams. I didn't stop. My hand slid lower, brushing the waistband of his shorts, and with a flicker of hesitation, a fleeting moment where I almost pulled back, I tugged them down. I shed my hoodie, letting it fall to the floor with a soft thud, leaving me in a thin tank top that clung to my chilled skin. I pressed myself closer, his warmth seeping into me, thawing the cold loneliness that had taken root in my chest. Finally, he woke up. His eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused at first, then snapping wide with panic when they landed on me. "Lily," he rasped, his voice rough with sleep and confusion. I didn't let him finish. I leaned down, kissing him fierce and desperate, my lips crashing against his with a hunger I couldn't contain. For a split second he froze, his body tense beneath me, as if he couldn't process what was happening. But then he kissed me back. His hands gripped my shoulders, fingers digging in hard, his lips hot and trembling against mine. I pulled him closer, my hands fumbling as they slid down, stripping away the last scraps of fabric between us. I wasn't thinking, there was only sensation, only the raw, aching need to be closer to him, to fill the void that had been swallowing me whole. It unfolded like a tempest, wild and unstoppable, sweeping us both away. I lay beneath him, the weight of his body pressing me into the mattress, his breath ragged and hot against my ear. My hands clawed at his back, nails scraping across his skin as he moved, each motion sending shivers through me. I felt every rhythm, every desperate touch, every shuddering breath of his blending with the frantic pounding of my own heart. He breathed heavily, his hands gripping my hips with bruising force, and I felt myself unraveling beneath him, consumed by a heat I'd never known. We crossed every line, plunged past boundaries we were never meant to breach. My body tensed, a tidal wave of pleasure crashing over me, and I let out a stifled cry, my voice breaking as I trembled beneath him. He reached his peak too, his breath catching in sharp, uneven gasps, his body going rigid before collapsing beside me, sweat dripping from his brow, soaking into the pillow beneath him. Silence swallowed the room, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of our labored breathing. I lay there, my body still buzzing with the aftershocks, staring at him. Sweat glistened on his skin in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, tracing faint lines across his forehead and down his neck. His eyes, those warm brown eyes I'd always trusted, were now wide with panic, darting as if searching for an escape. He jolted upright, yanking the blanket over himself, his face draining of color as if he'd just woken from a nightmare. "Lily, no," he said, his voice cracking with horror. "We can't do this." I sat up, my hair plastered to my face with sweat, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. "Dad, it's okay," I whispered, reaching for him, my hand shaking. "I wanted this. I need you." I didn't know if I was telling the truth or just clinging to a lie to make sense of it all. All I knew was I didn't want that moment to slip away. I wanted to hold on to him, to keep that feeling alive forever. But he shook his head, scrambling out of bed, putting distance between us. "No, Lily. This isn't right. You're my daughter, not like this." His voice trembled, but there was steel in it, a resolve that cut through me like a blade. He turned away, his hands gripping the armrest of the old chair in the corner, his shoulders shaking as if he were fighting to hold himself together. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, shame and pain flooding through me like a tidal wave. I pulled the blanket around myself, curling into a tight ball on the bed, feeling smaller and more wrong than I ever had in my life. "Dad, don't go," I sobbed, my voice breaking in the oppressive silence, but he didn't turn back. He just stood there, motionless, a silhouette against the faint light, And I knew in that moment that everything between us had changed forever. I couldn't sleep after leaving Tom's room. When I quietly climbed out of his bed, pulled my old hoodie back over my head, and slipped out of that room, everything seemed to linger in the air. The warmth of his body, the faint scent of sweat mingled with the cold coffee from the mug he'd left on the nightstand. I glanced back one last time, seeing him still standing there, his back pressed against the armchair in the corner, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, his shoulders trembling as if he were wrestling with a torrent of emotions. The bed was still a mess, the sheets crumpled from what had just happened, and my body still quivered, an echo of the moment we'd crossed every boundary. My mind spun in a whirlwind of shame, guilt, and a feeling I couldn't name. A deep emptiness laced with a longing I didn't dare acknowledge. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet trembling on the cold wooden floor, the tiny creaks sounding like a reminder of my presence in this house. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare call out to him, though every part of me wanted to run back into that room, drop to my knees before him, and scream that I wasn't sorry, that I needed him more than ever. But I couldn't move. I made it back to my own room, shut the door behind me, and collapsed onto my bed, wrapping myself tightly in the blanket as tears poured out uncontrollably. My pillow soaked up the tears, the old cotton fabric carrying the familiar scent of my childhood. Nights when I'd sneak into Tom's room because I was afraid of the dark or haunted by nightmares. Nights when he'd hold me and tell me stories until I drifted off to sleep. I remember the first time I met Tom. I was 8. A skinny little girl with wild curly hair and eyes always full of wariness. Mom brought him home one rainy afternoon, and he stood at the door in a drenched coat with an awkward smile. "This is Tom," she said, her voice trembling slightly as if she feared I'd reject him. I didn't like him at first. I didn't want anyone replacing my real dad, even though that man had walked out on Mom and me when I was too young to recall his face. But Tom didn't try to replace anyone. He slipped into our lives quietly, bringing an old rusty bike he'd fixed up to teach me how to ride. I still remember the day he knelt beside me on the gravel path in front of the house, his hand steadying the seat, his deep warm voice saying, "Don't be scared, Lily. I won't let you fall." I fell, of course, knees scraped, tears streaming, but he didn't laugh, didn't walk away. He just sat down, patched me up and said, "Let's try again. I know you can do it." That was the first time I felt he wasn't just some stranger Mom had brought home. Over the years, Tom became an unshakable part of my life. He wasn't the type to gush with affection. He was clumsy, sometimes grumbling when I spilled milk on the table or forgot to clean my room, but he was always there. I remember evenings when he'd sit at the kitchen table, patiently working through math problems with me even though he had to dig out the textbook to double-check. I recall the times he'd stand outside the school gate, waiting silently for me to finish class when Mom was stuck at her night shift. His coat soaked from the rain but his smile lighting up when I ran out. Once when I got bullied at school, a group of older girls shoved me down in the courtyard, leaving me with swollen eyes. I came home a wreck. Tom didn't say much. He just sat beside me on the couch, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "They're not worth your tears, Lily. You're stronger than they think." I leaned on him not just as a stepfather, but as someone I could trust completely. But now, looking back on those moments, I wonder if I'd misread something. If the safety he offered had slowly twisted into a longing I hadn't recognized until tonight. The next morning, I left the house before the sun rose. I couldn't face Tom, couldn't look into his eyes after what we'd done. I couldn't face Mom either. She'd see right through me and I didn't know how to explain. I hurriedly stuffed a few clothes into my backpack, scribbling a short note on the kitchen table. Heading back to the dorm early. "Don't worry." I knew Mom would worry anyway, but I had no other choice. As I stepped out the door, I heard Tom's footsteps on the stairs. He'd woken up, probably alerted by my fumbling, but I didn't turn back. I ran to the bus stop, my heart pounding, and only when I sank into the back seat, watching the house fade through the window, did I let myself sob. The days that followed were an endless nightmare. I returned to the dorm, locked myself in my room, and shut out the world. My roommate Mia kept knocking, asking if I was okay, but I'd just mutter through the crack in the door, "I'm fine. Leave me alone." I wasn't fine. Every time I closed my eyes I saw Tom. His body pressed against mine, his breath hot in my ear, the way he trembled when he reached his peak, and then the panic in his eyes when he pushed me away. I felt disgusted with myself, but at the same time a part of me ached to relive that moment. I didn't understand why. I didn't love him romantically, not the way people write about in books or show in movies. But I needed him, needed the way he held me, needed to know I wasn't alone in this world. And now I'd ruined everything. I avoided every call from Tom. My phone buzzed incessantly that first week, his name flashing on the screen with short messages. Lily, we need to talk? Or are you okay? Call me back. I didn't respond. I couldn't face his voice, couldn't bear hearing him say again that what we'd done was wrong, even though I knew it was. I deleted the messages, silenced the ringer, and threw myself into hollow, endless days, going to class but not listening, eating half-hearted meals, and lying in bed staring at the ceiling until dawn broke. But the memory of that night wouldn't leave me. It clung to me like a ghost, slipping into every dream, every moment I tried to escape. I started wondering if I was the one who destroyed our relationship, or if he bore some of the blame for giving in to me, even if just for a fleeting second. 2 weeks later, Tom showed up at my dorm. I was curled up on my bed, knees to my chest, when I heard a firm, deliberate knock. I opened the door, and there he was, wearing that old jacket I used to tease him about, his brown eyes filled with worry. Lily, he said, his voice low but shaky. We need to talk. Now. I wanted to slam the door, to scream that I couldn't face him, but my feet wouldn't move. I let him in, and he stood in the middle of the room, hands shoved in his pockets like he didn't know where to start. That night was a mistake, he said, looking straight into my eyes. I'm sorry I let it happen. I should have stopped it from the beginning, but I didn't. And I'll never forgive myself for that. But you're my daughter, Lily, and I can't let this destroy our family. I broke down, tears streaming down my cheeks. I don't regret it, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. I just wanted you to be there for me. I didn't know what else to do. He shook his head, stepping closer but stopping short, as if afraid any touch would make things worse. You don't have to do anything, he said. I'm always here for you, but not like that. You need help, Lily. Not from me, but from someone who can help you figure out what's going on in your head. I won't abandon you, but we can't let this happen again. I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in my hands as sobs racked my body. He didn't leave right away. He stood there, silent, until I looked up and nodded. I'll try, I said, my voice choked. I'll find someone to talk to. He nodded back, his eyes flickering with a hint of relief, though still shadowed with sadness. When he left, I felt both empty and unburdened, as if a piece of the weight had lifted, but another part still pressed down on me. I knew he was right, but my heart was torn, yearning for something I couldn't have, and maybe never should have wanted. After that conversation with Tom at the dorm, I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. One path led to the pain and chaos I'd inflicted on myself, the other to a long journey of rediscovering who I was. I didn't go back home right away. I needed time, needed space to breathe, to process what had happened and why I'd let things spiral so far out of control. But the promise I'd made to Tom, that I'd find someone to talk to, wasn't just empty words. I knew I couldn't keep living with the shadow of that night hanging over me, and I didn't want it to define my relationship with him forever. The following week, I reached out to the university's counseling center. The woman who answered had a warm voice over the phone. She introduced herself as Rachel, a counselor. I didn't know where to begin when I stepped into her office. A small room with soft light streaming through the window, a green sofa, and a faint scent of peppermint essential oil lingering in the air. You don't have to tell me everything right away, Rachel said, her smile gentle and free of judgment. Just share what you're comfortable with. I sat there quietly for a moment, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Then slowly I started. I didn't dive into the details of that night. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to put it into words without feeling like a terrible person. Instead, I talked about my loneliness, the pressure from school, my fear of failure, and how I'd always relied on Tom as a safe haven. Rachel listened, never interrupting, just nodding occasionally or jotting something down in her small notebook. In the sessions that followed, I opened up more. I talked about Tom, not just about that night but about all the years he'd been there for me. I told her about the time he taught me to ride a bike on the gravel path in front of our house, about the evenings he sat at the kitchen table patiently helping me with homework, about how he always showed up right when I needed him most. And then during one session I broke down in tears when Rachel gently pointed out something. You don't need him the way you think you do, Lily. What you're craving isn't a relationship that crosses boundaries. It's the safety, the acceptance you feel from him as a father. Her words hit me like a cold gust of wind, clearing the fog in my mind, helping me see things more clearly. I'd been wrong. I'd twisted family love into something warped and forbidden, all because I was so desperate to feel like I mattered to someone. I started to change after those talks with Rachel. I stopped hiding. I went back to class, tried to focus on my studies, even though my mind sometimes drifted back to that night, a memory that refused to fade. I called Mom more often, chatting with her about everyday things, the weather back home, a test I'd just taken, or the meatloaf she made that I missed so badly. I didn't tell her about what happened with Tom, and I knew he hadn't either. It was our secret, a scar we both carried, but I was learning to live with it without letting it drag me down further. I also started reconnecting with friends, not to spill everything, but to bridge the gap I'd created to stop isolating myself. Mia, my roommate, was the first to notice the shift. You look less gloomy these days, she said one afternoon as we ate sandwiches in our room, the smoky aroma of bacon filling the space. I smiled, my first real smile in months, and felt a tiny spark of light creep into my heart. 6 months after that night, I decided to go home. I didn't call ahead, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to test whether I was strong enough to face Tom and Mom without preparing myself first. When I pushed the door open, Mom was in the kitchen, the smell of grilled steak and fries wafting through the house. She looked up, startled, then rushed over and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. "Why didn't you call so I could make extra food?" She laughed, half scolding, but I saw her eyes welling up. Tom appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing the old flannel shirt he always wore around the house, his brown eyes meeting mine with a hint of hesitation. I gave him a small smile, just enough to let him know I was okay. He nodded, silent, then walked into the kitchen to help Mom set the table. That dinner was the first time I felt like things could be normal again. Not exactly like they used to be, but close enough for us to keep going. I sat across from Tom, watching him grin at Mom as she rambled about a quirky customer at the grocery store, and I realized he was still the Tom I knew. Not the man from that fleeting moment of weakness, but the stepdad who'd stood by me through every storm. After dinner, while Mom washed dishes in the kitchen, I stayed with Tom in the living room. We didn't talk much, just sat there quiet, but the silence wasn't suffocating anymore. "Thanks, Dad," I said, my voice soft but steady. He looked at me, his eyes flickering with relief tinged with sadness, then nodded. "I'm always here, Lily," he said, and I knew he meant it. Not just a comforting platitude, but a promise. As time passed, I learned that life isn't about perfect moments. It's about how we pick ourselves up after we fall. That night with Tom was a mistake, a blemish I couldn't erase, but also a lesson carved deep into my soul. It taught me about boundaries, the value of family love and forgiveness, not just for Tom but for myself. I realized I didn't need to cross lines to feel loved or worthy. Tom was still my stepdad, and though our bond now carried a scar, it had grown stronger in its own way. I didn't crave him in that wrong way anymore. I just needed him as a dad, the one who stood behind me, quiet and steadfast, like a lighthouse guiding me through life's tempests. I kept seeing Rachel once a month. Not because I was still a mess, but because I wanted to keep my mind clear and steady. I threw myself back into school with a new purpose, not to prove anything to anyone, but to build a life I could be proud of. I started writing, not to recount that night, but to capture my thoughts, my feelings, the lessons I'd gleaned along the way. Maybe one day, I'd have the courage to share my story with the world. Not for absolution from others, but to remind myself that I'd made it through the darkest days. Now, sitting in my dorm room watching raindrops patter against the window, I feel a peace I'd never known before. Tom still calls me every week, checking on my schoolwork, reminding me to eat properly, and sometimes sending goofy texts like, "Don't forget your raincoat. Looks like a downpour's coming." He never brings up that night, but I know he carries his own scar, a pain he keeps buried to shield me and Mom. I'm not afraid to think about him anymore. I'm just grateful, because he didn't abandon me, even after I pushed him into a situation neither of us wanted. Life isn't easy, and I know I'll stumble plenty more times along the way. But I've learned a precious lesson. Real love doesn't need to cross forbidden lines to prove its worth. Sometimes what we need most is the quiet presence of those who care for us and the strength to let go of what doesn't belong to us. I found Tom again, not as the man from that mistaken moment, but as my stepdad, my guide, and I know that no matter how rough the road ahead gets, I won't have to walk it alone. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with this story. Have you ever faced moments that made you question boundaries or love? And how did you get through them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your experiences. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel to catch more emotional stories like this one. We'll dive into all kinds of life's hidden corners together, and I hope you'll stick around for the journey.